Undercover boss buys breakfast at his diner, freezes when he hears the waitress sobbing alone. "You can't sit here." The voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to drop the cozy temperature of the cafe by a few degrees. Michael Foster, 50 years old, paused slightly. He hadn't even set down his small backpack when he was stopped by the sharp gaze of the midday shift manager, Linda Hardy. She wore the cafe's standard polo, her name tag pinned squarely on the left side of her chest, standing behind the bar like a gatekeeper to something not easily accessible. The room was calm. Soft jazz played through the ceiling speakers. The scent of diluted Arabica coffee blended with the smell of fresh pastries from the oven. But suddenly, none of that mattered when faced with a look so devoid of welcome. Michael, dressed in sand-colored khakis and a pale gray Oxford shirt, looked no different than a passerby stopping in for lunch. A faded blue cap shadowed his salt and pepper hair. His white canvas shoes were worn at the edges. No one in the cafe guessed that this was the founder of Maple Lane Cafe, once dubbed the corner of hospitality. And no one knew that today he didn't return as a CEO, but simply as a man hoping for a quiet meal in the place where he once poured his heart into every blueprint and every tile on the floor. 12:03 p.m. Early summer light slanted through the window, casting a soft glow on the small wooden table near the glass, the spot Michael gravitated toward, holding onto a faint hope that this place still had its original soul. "But," Linda cut in, "that table is for regulars," she said, her tone not loud but drawn like a preset boundary. Michael stopped. Partly out of politeness. Partly because he was too familiar with silence, something he had learned to listen to like a real CEO. But this time, silence wasn't enough to soothe the bruise. He didn't argue. He simply stepped back, pulling out a chair at a smaller table near the walkway, a dim corner where the sunlight didn't reach. The kind of seat usually given to those who weren't meant to be seen. Linda turned away without a smile. She gestured toward Joe, a server, to take the order. But clearly the entire team had no interest in the man who had just arrived. Michael lifted the menu. His hand trembled slightly, not from anger, but from a gnawing question inside him. What had made Maple Lane his own brainchild feel so foreign? All he wanted was a slice of almond butter toast and a cup of black coffee, the same kind he had brewed himself on the very first morning of this branch's grand opening 12 years ago. But what he received today wasn't a meal. It was a bitter truth: when a system grows too large, even its own creator may no longer feel welcome in the home he built. A soft clatter sounded behind him. The espresso machine hummed to life. Joe, the young staff member, glanced briefly at Michael, no greeting, no question, then continued his routine as if the man in front of him was no more than an empty chair. Michael sat in silence. His eyes lingered on the price board mounted on the wall, still in the same font he once chose CAF for everyone. Made with kindness. The words remained. But the spirit, it had been replaced by something invisible, cold and selective. And at that moment, the satisfaction factor began to stir in the hearts of viewers because they sensed something was off. They knew a turning point was coming, though they didn't know when. They were being guided to ask with Michael what had gone wrong. Sometimes it only takes a single moment, a cold stare, a polite rejection wrapped in veiled exclusion, to spark a wave of empathy in an audience. Emotion doesn't need to shout. It only needs one detail: a CEO sitting tucked away beside a cold wall in the very place he once called the beacon of hospitality. Some customers glanced at him, none recognized him. But one pair of eyes behind the bar lingered longer than usual. Sophie, 20 years old, her brown hair tied loosely. She watched quietly, saying nothing. Those eyes in that brief moment were the only light left in a cafe, slowly forgetting who it was. Michael exhaled, softly, almost inaudibly. But that breath was the first ripple in a sequence of changes the audience didn't yet see coming. Linda crossed her arms, her red-painted nails tapping lightly on her sleeve. She stood in the center aisle, her voice not raised, but sharp as a blade. That table is for regulars. If you're only ordering coffee, please choose another seat. Or get it to go. She didn't look Michael in the eyes as she said it. She looked at his faded cap as if trying to measure a man's worth by the material of his hat. Michael looked up. his expression unreadable. But deep in his eyes, something stirred, not anger, not shock, just a quiet note of disappointment too deep to name. He didn't respond. He simply reached for the glass of water left on the table, a glass left behind by a previous customer. He lifted it as if trying to soothe his throat or perhaps the thoughts surging inside. A small sip. Then he placed the glass back down gently.
Not because the water was cold,
But because he needed to check something within himself. Had the culture of hospitality, once the very soul of Maple Lane Cafe, truly vanished, Linda remained still. She didn't move. As if Michael's presence was just a small disturbance, one that needed to be corrected quickly to preserve the aesthetic of her shift. The air in the cafe suddenly thickened. A couple at the table opposite glanced over, then went back to tapping on their phones. A middle-aged man in the corner lowered his newspaper just enough to peek, then lifted it again. No one spoke. No one intervened. But behind the counter, Sophie, the young barista, paused while wiping the espresso machine. Her eyes met Michael's for a fleeting moment, a look filled with both confusion and caution, but not apathy. Michael didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't speak in protest. He remained silent. And in that setting, silence was the boldest move of all. Because he wasn't sitting there as someone powerful waiting to be recognized. He was sitting there as a test. To listen not with ears, but with the awareness of how a system treats someone it doesn't know the name of. Linda turned and walked away, leaving one last comment behind her like a closing line: "We prioritize customers who order full meals." Michael followed her silhouette with his eyes, then looked back at the menu on the wall. The wooden frame was yellowed, the print faded, but the handwritten tagline he once crafted was still there: Maple Lane Coffee for everyone. A simple line. But now it felt like nothing more than a memory tacked to the wall. And in that exact moment, the satisfaction factor began to rise, not from any dramatic twist, but from the quiet weight of suppressed emotion. The audience began to feel Michael's pain. They began to hope for a turning point. They didn't need retaliation. They just wanted to see justice find its way in. Michael looked down at the napkin beneath the glass. There was a faint coffee stain on it, anonymous, unnoticed. Just like him in that moment, a man unacknowledged in the very place he once called home. And yet, he didn't leave. Because some things can't be judged at first glance. And some lessons only emerge when you sit long enough to see what's real. A slow breath. One fingertip tapped lightly on the tabletop. Michael wasn't waiting for a meal. He was waiting for a sign, however small, that someone in this place still understood the spirit he once poured into every brick, every coffee bean. And perhaps that sign was about to be drawn out. The soft swish of a broom brushing the floor echoed from the corner of the cafe, blending with the background jazz music. The atmosphere of Maple Lane Cafe seemed peaceful, but the air was beginning to tighten like the thin mist that settles on a cup of coffee left unstirred. Dean, a young server about 22 with tousled brown hair and a latte-stained apron, slowly approached Michael's table. He paused, scratched the back of his neck, and leaned down slightly as if about to share something discreet. "Sir, this table might not be the best spot," Dean said, voice low. "Customers like you usually sit alone and don't tip much." A soft statement, but like a blade running across glass, not deep but leaving a scratch that never quite fades. Michael didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the wooden menu, his hand lightly touching the edge of the paper as if reading, but really to steady himself. He knew that line wasn't just meant for him. It was the system speaking out loud what should never have had a place in any cafe named Maple Lane. Around him, the clink of spoons against porcelain. A chair slid slightly. A few customers turned to look, none said a word. An elderly couple near the window glanced at each other, then lowered their heads, as if they had just witnessed something wrong but didn't feel close enough to fix it. Michael slowly closed his eyes, not from fatigue, but perhaps from something deeper still. It wasn't anger. It was something inside him that had quietly cracked something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Dean was still standing there, stepping back slightly, visibly unsure. But his eyes showed no remorse. They carried the look of someone trained wrong from the start without even realizing it. Michael opened his eyes, and his gaze no longer belonged to a customer. It was the look of a founder facing something that stood in stark contrast to the values he had built. He spoke softly without raising his voice. "I only ordered coffee. But I came to sit as a human being, not to be judged as a number." Dean stepped back another half step, but before he could speak again, Linda, the manager, returned from behind the counter. Her voice sharper. "Dean, let me handle this. Customers like that, it's best to settle their bill and send them out. Customers like that." 3 simple words, but they struck like a hammer on the door of collapse. A calf chain built on community respect and open arms was now treating its own founder like a low-value customer just because he didn't look impressive. Michael still didn't rise. He set down the menu, his eyes drifting across each face, not to demand justice for himself, but to see who, if anyone, would speak up for it. And then something small, yet weighty, happened. Sophie, the young barista from earlier, left the espresso machine.
She didn't say a word.
She simply walked over and gently placed a fresh glass of water in front of him, replacing the old one. She didn't say "I'm sorry." She didn't need to. It was a small gesture, but in this moment it was like the first flicker of light in a dark room. Michael gave a slight nod, and for the first time he offered a faint smile. Not a smile of contentment, but the smile of someone seeing hope amid the ashes. Dean fumbled. Linda glared at Sophie, ready to say something, but held it back. The atmosphere in the cafe began to shift. The heavy silence began to fracture. A young customer by the door, still holding his phone-tapped record. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but his instincts told him this moment needs to be captured. Michael lifted the new glass of water. He didn't drink, just raised it slightly. "Thank you," he said, the first words he had spoken to a staff member in this cafe all day. And with that "thank you," the viewers could feel something stirring. They knew something was coming. A truth, a confrontation, a lesson not taught through power, but through kindness that couldn't be denied. The phone vibrated slightly in the young man's hand. His name was Liam, a software engineer who had stopped by Maple Lane to wait for a client. But the client was late, and now Liam was holding something that might shake the entire system. Liam wasn't the type to get involved, but his eyes, sharp and observant, had seen enough the way Dean leaned in to whisper the arch of Linda's brow and the quiet stillness of the older man with the worn fabric cap. He hit save. He didn't share. Not yet. But what satisfied the viewers the most was that Liam didn't just record. He did something different. Liam stood up. Not in a rush. Not loudly. He walked to the counter where Linda stood with arms folded, eyes flicking toward Michael and Sophie as if she had just swallowed something bitter.
"Excuse me," Liam said, his voice calm but firm.
"I think you need to take a closer look at how you're treating customers at this location."
Linda turned, brow tightening but wore a practiced smile.
"Is there something you're unhappy with? We always follow protocol here." Liam set his phone down on the counter.
Tapped play.
The clip lasted just 15 seconds, Dean's voice saying customers like him usually sit alone, followed by Linda's sharp reply, "People like that, just send them out." The sound was crystal clear. The camera angle was sharp, capturing both of their faces. Undeniable. Unjustifiable. Linda flinched, then went pale. Liam didn't need to say anything else. He simply pocketed his phone, gave a small nod, and returned to his seat, but not the one from before. He sat at the table directly across from Michael. At that moment, the audience began to feel what they'd been hoping for all along, a timely stand from an unexpected outsider. Satisfaction didn't come from yelling, nor from dramatic takedowns. It came from calm, unwavering resolve.
Sophie, still nearby, looked at Liam.
Her eyes lit up with something new. In that moment, she reached up, pulled her staff badge from her neck. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze had never been firmer. She walked over to Michael and bowed slightly. I'd like to end my shift." But before I leave, if you need anything, I'm here to help. Michael looked at her for the first time with genuine warmth. Just keep doing what you did, he said. That's enough. Sophie nodded. No one stopped her. No one dared. Dean, the server, who first approached Michael, stood frozen behind the counter. His face was flushed red. His lips parted as if to explain himself, but then he looked at Linda, and for the first time, something in his eyes shifted. Something inside him was breaking, but also starting to rebuild. A cracked identity stirred by the small acts of a barista and a stranger. Dean removed his apron, but he didn't leave. He walked directly toward Michael. The whole calf seemed to hold its breath. Dean stood there, his arms by his side, his eyes no longer filled with the confidence they held earlier. I'm sorry, he said. Each word clear. No excuses. I was taught wrong, and I'm trying to understand things differently now. Michael didn't nod. He didn't shake his head either. He simply said, "What's right, you'll have to learn on your own. But knowing you were wrong, that's a good first step." That sentence, just a handful of words, wrapped up the quiet satisfaction of every viewer watching this unfold. No need for punishment. No need for preaching. Just a chance for someone to change. Linda by now had stepped into the storage room. She locked the door behind her. No one called after her. No one waited. Outside that room, something had already begun to shift. Liam sat down, opened his laptop, but his eyes remained on Michael. He didn't ask anything. He didn't pry. But within his gaze was a respect that couldn't be hidden. Michael slowly picked up his now cold coffee, took a small sip, and for the first time that day, he truly smiled.
Then Michael reached into his breast pocket.
Pulled out his phone, the motion slow but deliberate. The screen's glow lit up his face, calm and steady like a still lake before a storm. He pressed a button. "Emily," he said, each word sharp and clear. "Activate Protocol 7. On the other end, a woman's voice, familiar, composed, fell silent for half a second before replying, "Ready, sir." He said nothing more, ended the call, and then he stood. No one stopped him. No one knew what was happening, but the room had changed. It was as if the temperature dropped by several degrees, even though the air conditioning hadn't changed. Michael walked to the center of the calf, his stride slow, deliberate. His shadow stretched across the light wooden floor. The coffee in his cup still half full, but no one cared about the taste anymore. Every gaze had landed on him. He stopped in front of the bar counter, Linda still behind it, trying to appear composed, but her clenched fists betrayed her.
Dean stood nearby.
His eyes flickering between regret and confusion. Michael looked around. A full sweep. No rush. Not angry. Then he spoke low and sharp like a formal declaration, "I am Michael Foster." A thunderbolt, without sound, seemed to crack the air. "I founded the new Dawn Calf system 12 years ago for one reason, only to create a place where everyone who walked in would be welcomed as a human being, not judged by their wallet or appearance."
A sharp gasp came from a corner table.
Linda stepped back half a pace. Her lips trembled. "No, that can't be." Michael didn't stop. "Today, I didn't come here for breakfast. I came to witness something that internal reports could never tell me. Numbers don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth either." His eyes passed over Dean. "And what just happened that said everything?" Silence descended. Not the kind that follows confusion, but the kind that comes when every mask falls away and there's nowhere left to hide. A female customer exhaled sharply. The man beside her placed a hand over his mouth, trying to contain his shock. Liam, the young man who had filmed everything, tilted his head, his eyes still glued to the phone as if ready to go live at any moment. Linda swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. "Mr. Foster, I didn't recognize." Michael turned. For the first time, he truly looked at her. "The problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is, you don't recognize anyone unless they belong to the class you deem worthy. Linda froze. Dean stared at the ground. He opened his mouth, but Michael raised his hand. Not to silence him, but to close the chapter. I don't need an explanation. Your actions already spoke. Right then, the caf door swung open. A woman in a black blazer entered holding a tablet, followed by 2 other staff members. They walked straight to Michael and gave a respectful nod. HR is here. We received the emergency signal from Protocol 7. Customers began murmuring. Linda took a step back, her voice trembling. You can't fire me? Ah! Michael's tone turned cold as steel. No, I'm not firing you. You already did that yourself the moment you used your tiny bit of power to belittle a customer. The satisfaction the audience felt now wasn't just about the unmasking. It was this Michael's patience had finally transformed into decisive fair action. He turned to Liam and gave a subtle nod. Thank you for not staying silent. Liam nodded back.
There was a flicker of emotion in his eyes.
Then an elderly man near the window stood up leaning on a cane. He stepped beside Michael. I was the first customer to ever have coffee here on the day this place opened. And today I remember why I once believed in it. He gave Michael a gentle pat on the shoulder. But that simple touch in a room where the tension had only just thawed rang like a bell of restored hope. Immediately after, a round of applause rose from the back of the caf. One by one, regular strangers, the young, the elderly, they stood up and clapped. Not because they knew who he was, but because they saw something good, finally unmistakably had been done. Just once, in an ordinary moment of life, justice had won. A soft sound echoed beep. The woman in the black blazer had just scanned her ID card confirming temporary authority over the branch on her tablet. The screen turned green, then lit up with the message, temporary managerial authority granted. Personnel changes effective immediately. Michael tilted his head. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of a door closing for good. Linda Green, he said firmly. Your position as branch manager at Maple Lane Caf is officially revoked. Effective immediately. The murmurs turned into a chilling silence. Linda froze, her hands hanging awkwardly. Her eyes flickered, panic swelling. But worse than that, no one looked at her as someone in power anymore. There was no one left to command. No one left to lean on to save face.
She was now just a person standing in the middle of a crowd stripped of the control she once thought was permanent.
Michael said nothing more to her. Instead, he turned to the HR team and gestured toward Sophie, the young barista, who had been quietly observing beside the espresso machine. Sophie acted rightly in the wrongest of situations. She will serve as interim manager until we appoint someone permanent.
Sophie froze.
Her mouth parted as if to decline, but no words came out. Her whole body seemed locked in place. Michael looked at her eyes filled with trust, not pressure. Well done, no need to make noise, he said gently yet firmly. This system needs more people like you. A second round of applause broke out, but this time, not for Michael. It was for Sophie, for the one who dared place a fresh glass of water before someone being mistreated. Dean, once the focal point of the conflict, quietly took off his apron. He stepped forward, facing Michael. Sir, I have nothing to defend myself with. Michael didn't answer right away. He simply looked into the young man's eyes as if reading something even Dean hadn't yet put into words. Then a soft nod. Then don't say anything. Just prove it with the way you'll change.
Dean bowed his head deeply.
No plea. No excuse. Only an acceptance. And the beginning in silent gratitude. Michael turned around. His eyes scanned the wooden tables where customers were still standing, not to leave, but to witness a moment they knew they'd carry with them for a long time. He raised his hand not high. Just enough for those watching to understand this morning had reached its conclusion. Not with a press release. Not with a performative apology, but with a decision made right where the damage had begun. The caf door opened once more. Midday sunlight streamed through the glass, catching on Michael's light gray suit. He turned one last time. I didn't build New Dawn to become the biggest calf chain. I built it to become the smallest place that still held on to its soul. He walked out. No need for anyone to escort him. But behind him, a third round of applause rose slower, deeper, and warmer than before. No longer reflexive, but filled with profound agreement. A single act of reckoning and an entire system was saved. Michael stood tall. No more words were needed, and yet he turned around one final time to face the entire calf. His gaze drew an invisible line between leniency and principle, between what's temporary and what's ideal. All lunch shift staff suspended immediately. No one laughed. No one even breathed too loudly. There were no clinks of spoons against cups, no background whir of coffee grinders. Only a weighted silence, like the sound of a door closing behind a chapter that's now over. Right then, the calf doors swung open. Emily Parkhead of Human Resources walked in. Charcoal gray suit. Hair tied up neatly. Her eyes were calm but unyielding. She was followed by two assistants holding thick folders stamped in red like sealed verdicts waiting to be read. Emily didn't need an introduction. She stood in the center of the calf and spoke. Maple Lane branch will be temporarily closed for 48 hours. Michael nodded once. Emily continued, we will be conducting a full review of service procedures, conduct protocols, and individual performance. All reports will be sent directly to the Founders Council. No one protested, because everyone knew the silence so far had already said enough. Michael walked slowly toward the espresso counter. There in the corner, an old wall clock was still ticking, but each second seemed to drag as if time itself was stepping aside to let memory flood in. He placed his hand on the wooden counter. His fingers traced a small scratch, the same spot where 12 years ago he had dropped his first cappuccino while learning to brew one-handed. A faint smile crossed his face. Not out of regret, but because he remembered this place had started with sincerity, not judgment. Then he looked up, voice steady, eyes firm. It's not because you don't know how to make coffee. He looked each person in the eye. No scolding. No humiliation. Just seeing. It's because you forgot how to serve a person without pricing them by their appearance or their receipt. Linda stood at the end of the counter. Her blouse now wrinkled, lips pressed tight. The pride was gone. Only a woman remained standing in the wreckage she had created. Dean stood to the right, fingers nervously tugging the strap of his apron as if it was the last thread holding him together. He started to speak, but then stopped himself. There were no words left that could fix what had already been revealed. Michael didn't linger on them. Instead, he turned to Sophie, still standing near the machine, milk stains on her hand from the last drink she'd made. Their eyes met. This afternoon, he said, if anyone stops by, even knowing we're temporarily closed, offer them a glass of water. And tell them one thing new, Dawn will be back better. Sophie nodded.
This time with no trembling.
No fear. Only the calm of someone newly ignited. In that moment, the audience felt that the wrongdoers were held accountable on the spot. The one who acted with integrity was not only seen but entrusted. The system was being reset back to its human roots. And the boss didn't walk away after delivering punishment, but stayed to rebuild. Michael looked around the calf once more, not like a man leaving, but like one beginning again from within. Ding! A soft chime rang from the entrance. Everyone turned. A little girl around 10 years old stood on the threshold. She held a small envelope. Her school uniform was wrinkled from the long walk. Behind her stood a woman, likely her mother, hands stained with soil, feet in worn-out rubber sandals. The girl stepped inside hesitantly. Sophie rushed from the machine, leaned down to ask softly, but the girl shook her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on Michael. Mr. Foster? She asked. Michael paused. Her voice was soft but steady. I have something for you. The little girl extended an envelope. He accepted it and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of lined notebook paper written in neat pencil. Thank you for giving my mom a chance to work again at New Dawn and for the first warm meal in 2 months. Michael looked up. The mother stood quietly at the door, eyes brimming with tears. No words were needed, everyone understood. She had once been an employee at another branch dismissed for unacceptable attitude after failing to greet a customer on a particularly exhausting morning. A soft round of applause came from a corner table. Not for Michael, but for what had just taken place, a small act that touched something deep. Someone had been truly given a second chance, and they cherished it with everything they had. Michael stepped toward the little girl. He bent down, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "What's your name, Dahlia?" she replied. "Dahlia," he repeated, his voice quiet but warm. "You just taught me something very important."
She smiled, her eyes as clear as morning sunlight.
Michael stood up and turned to Emily. "Note this down from today. All staff who were terminated for unsuitable attitude within the past 6 months will be invited for re-interview provided they have no history of ethical violations." Emily nodded immediately. One of the assistants pulled out a phone and began recording the note. Satisfaction rippled outward from the center of the story to the screen where viewers were watching, because those once forgotten were now remembered. Because rigid policies were softened by compassion. And because justice today didn't stop at punishment but extended toward restoration. At that moment, the chime above the door rang again. This time, no one flinched. They were ready to welcome anyone with fresh eyes. Michael had just placed his hand on the door handle when a soft voice rose behind him. Gentle but echoing through the room like a final bell before a day was complete, "Sir," a female voice, quiet but unwavering. Michael turned. From behind the counter, a young woman stepped forward. Her barista uniform slightly wrinkled, hair tied hastily, canvas shoes worn and faded. She stopped in place, every eye now on her. "My name is Tina," she said. "I work the afternoon shift 3 times a week. I'm still in college, majoring in hospitality management." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes were red. Not from weakness, but from trying too long without ever really being heard. "Some days I go to class without eating. And I used to think maybe I wasn't good enough for this job." The calf fell silent once more. But this time, it wasn't the silence of shock. It was silence born of sorrow. Michael walked over. Not rushed. He stood before Tina, his eyes no longer those of an executive, but of a father, a teacher, a man who once knew what it felt like to hunger for a dream. "Tina," he said, her name clearly, completely. "Tomorrow, you'll be the first trainee in the program that will retrain our entire system." A wave of murmurs stirred across the calf. But Michael wasn't finished, not because you are pitiful. He bent forward slightly, not to look down on her, but to meet her at eye level. "But because you had the courage to say what others kept hidden." The truth, when spoken by the quietest voice, carries more weight than any title ever printed on paper. A single clap rang out from the far corner of the calf. An elderly customer in a worn blazer rose to his feet. Then another person joined in. It was as if the air itself had been cleansed. This round of applause wasn't for the CEO. Not for the revelation. Not for the dismissal. It was for the fact that something right had just happened instantly. Recognition. Reinforcement. A beginning. Michael took a step back. His eyes scanned the calf one last time. Not to inspect, but to feel something deeper than wages shifts or KIs. He opened the door and stepped out. The midday sunlight filtered through the glass, casting soft reflections on his pale gray coat, a warm light, not harsh, just enough to reveal a faint reflection, new dawn calf. That old logo rested quietly, but beneath it was a promise never written and never needing to be. Justice doesn't hang on the wall. It lives in how you place a cup of coffee in front of someone without asking if they can afford it. Michael did not look back. The door closed behind him, not like an ending, but like the first page of something new. Justice doesn't need to be decorated with fancy words. It needs to show up when no one is asking for it. Power does not live in a title. It lives in whether you step forward when someone weaker has been pushed aside. True change does not begin on a stage. It begins in action when no one knows who you are.